all societies are collections of minorities, and therefore a society works best if one can forego the desire to try and achieve some sort of uniformity or identity, and instead one seeks to achieve harmony. Harmony is a much better aim than uniformity or identity. Recognizing the diversity that there is among individuals and the fact that any society is a texture made up of many different threads is very, very important, especially understanding that things can really deeply matter to people whose experience, whose outlook, whose interests are not yours. And so an educated person, that is a person whose mind is furnished, broadened by this wider understanding, is absolutely vital.
Welcome to Education Matters. This is another installment in our Big Ideas series, where we explore the thinkers, traditions, and questions that sit at the very heart of what education is and what it might become. If you've listened to this series before, you'll know it's not just about interesting guests, it's about pushing us to think harder, deeper, and more carefully about what kind of world we want to build. Today's guest is someone who embodies that spirit fully. Professor Anthony Grayling. Professor Grayling is one of the world's most respected public philosophers. He is the principal of Northeastern University in London, a supernumerary fellow at the St. Anne College in Oxford, and the author of over 30 books spanning philosophy, the history of ideas, and public ethics. He's been a columnist for The Guardian, The Times, and Prospect, and a familiar voice on the BBC and international media. He is also the Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Vice President of Humanities UK, and Patron of the Defense Humanists, Honorary Associate of Secular Society, and a Patron of Dignity in Dying. But more than all of that, he is a tireless advocate for reason, dialogue, and the enduring relevance of the humanities. In this conversation, we talk about why philosophy is central to a good education and the formation of good citizens, and how philosophy is, in fact, the very framework that allows every other subject to make sense. We dive deep into the figure of Socrates and what the Socratic method offers us in an age of misinformation, polarization, and artificial intelligence. We explore the difference between training and education, and why the former, without the latter, leaves us unprepared for a rapidly changing world. We talk about Professor Grayling's time at Oxford, why he founded his own college and university, and how we might use AI to rediscover more human-centered forms of learning and not automate them away. For educators, Grayling offers a powerful defense of philosophy as a way of cultivating not only sharper thinkers, but more empathetic, democratic citizens. And for everyone else listening, especially those wrestling with the pace of modern life, he offers a handrail, so to speak, a tradition of thoughtful, disciplined inquiry that can help us navigate the uncertainty ahead. This is a wide-ranging, insightful conversation with one of the great humanists of our time. Now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Professor Anthony Grayling. Good morning, Professor Grayling. Welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
It finds me in my apartment in Paris after a very satisfying morning's work on a book I'm currently writing.
Oh, wonderful. What's the book on?
Well, the book is about the long-term consequences of the great changes that happened in the three great civilizations of China, India, and Greece in the axial period around the 5th century BCE.
Oh, excellent. That's very interesting. And we're going to have to chat about that, but maybe on another podcast because I have a lot of interest in that area. But for today's purpose, this is one of the episodes that I am doing on the importance of philosophy in our current education system. So I'm very thrilled to have you with us. But I always want to start the podcast by introducing the guest to the audience by starting with where and when you grew up.
Well, my family are English, but my father worked abroad pretty well all his life. And so I was born and brought up in the parts of Africa now known as Zambia and Malawi. So I passed my childhood there. I had the major part of my education in the UK, and I had developed an interest very early in philosophy through the fact that we had a set of encyclopedia at home in which I found, browsing through it, some pictures, as it happened, of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and I was intrigued by them, tried to make sense of the entries in the encyclopedia, but of course, short entries are very unsatisfying. And so when, at the age of 12, by pure serendipity, I came across the dialogues of Plato translated by Jowett in the local library. Now, you might think it rather surprising that there might be a set of Plato's works in a library in the middle of Africa. But it was because, of course, Brits who had been sent out to run the empire and promptly died of tropical diseases had families who didn't want to take their university books back home again. So there it was in this library. And I took it down and I read one of the early dialogues, the Charmides, which is about self-restraint, about self-government. And it's a very accessible dialogue. I was bowled over by it. I thought, if these great iconic figures of our civilization can devote themselves to thinking about these things, then I'm going to do likewise. And so it became a kind of passion, and that's what I dedicated myself to thereafter.
Well, I certainly want to spend a good chunk of the time today diving into Plato and specifically the figure of Socrates. But can I ask you just to reflect a moment longer on your childhood? How did you play as a child?
Say again, sorry, how did I play as a child?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, apart from the sorts of things the kids do, running around, throwing a ball, climbing trees, and so on, I was, because of the circumstances of our life in Africa, sort of obliged in a way to be a reader. So my greatest entertainment and pleasure was to curl up on the bed with a book in the hot, sleepy afternoons in Africa. And that was fortuitous because I think a love of reading early on is a great resource. It's something that inspires interest across a whole wide range of subjects, of course, makes one aware of the fact that there really are great narratives in the history of humanity, and particular accounts of individuals, so particular stories, as you might come across in novels, are entrances, they're kind of windows into the possibilities of life. But I've often thought, that literature itself is perhaps one of the greatest budgets of philosophical insight that one can have. It's not just the philosophers who have things to say about this, but indeed the storytellers, because, of course, the stories are about human experience.
Wonderful. So would you say literature was one of the first things that you loved learning, like one of your earliest memories of learning?
Yes, so literature, history, certainly, that early interest in philosophy. Curiosity, because once you inflame curiosity in a child, I think everything is grist to the mill, isn't it? So you begin to see that things connect up, that having a wide horizon of view of our world, of the human story, of human endeavor within that story, that all that prompts one with a tremendous desire, really, to make sense of it all, and to see how those connections between things can inform and help one shape a kind of outlook.
And did you have some early influences, whether family members or teachers, that really encouraged you to pursue your interest in ideas and literature and thinking?
I did have a couple of teachers who were rather inspirational. So my Latin master, for example, at school, who was a tremendous enthusiast for Latin poetry, for Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and the rest, that inspired a love in classical literature. And I had an English literature tutor who had the same kind of passion for poetry, for Shakespeare. Shakespeare has been a great love of mine all my life. And so early on, I picked up on the fact that one could be not merely devoted to this, but also that it contained a great deal that is very real. I'll give you an example. Our university term in the UK starts in August, September, and the early autumn comes on, and in the UK, the autumn is characterized by quite strong westerly winds, which is why the multicolored leaves on the trees don't last very long. Unlike New England in the States or in Japan, the autumn colors are very brief. And so the strong westerly wind blows these leaves down and they scuttle across the streets and heap up in piles. And so I point this out to my students. I make them look out of the window at the scuttling leaves. And I quote them Shelley's Ode to the Wild West Wind, which exactly and beautifully describes that very scene. And they can then see the direct connection between literature and life, literature and reality. And this is a way into persuading them that when they read history, for example, they should think these are not abstractions. These were real people who had toothache and woke up every morning to have breakfast and who thought the things they did and went to war or made great decisions that change matters. The kind of human reality in things is tremendously important. The difficulty that sometimes attends making ideas work in the world is important to understand also. These things extend people's sympathies and insights in ways that one hopes at any rate will be sort of richly informative for people living their own lives, making their own choices.
I think that's a wonderful way of describing it. I learned from one of the, dare I say it this way, one of the great Canadian masters of philosophy and especially literature, Marshall McLuhan. He loved to remind folks that the etymology of the Greek word for school meant leisure and was related to, how can I describe it? It's like a place to think, converse, and reflect together. Can you kind of expand on that idea for us and what do you think the ancient Greeks understood about learning that we've kind of forgotten or have misplaced?
Yes, that's a very, very good insight indeed. In fact, Aristotle wrote that we educate ourselves so that we can make a noble use of our leisure. They didn't think of education as something that prepares you for a job or career. They thought it was something which provided you, equipped you to think more broadly, to see that horizon I was talking about earlier, make sense of things, and help you to shape your life, therefore, to own your life. And so this idea that once the practical things were done and out of the way, that you should sit down with friends and chat, discuss, think about things, explore one another's ideas, offer ideas and have them tested. I mean, this seemed to them to be a really worthwhile thing to do. And indeed, if you consider that is and should be the very core of what we mean by education and distinguish education in that sense from training. Now, we have to train people. We want to teach multiplication tables and IT skills and what have you. These involve the acquisition of the practices that are necessary and provide the foundation for being able to reflect. But reflecting on them, looking back over what it is that we've acquired in the way of data, because data isn't knowledge. Information isn't knowledge. It's the organization of it which is knowledge. And not even knowledge is the last step, but understanding that knowledge and knowing when and how to use it, or even indeed if we should use it. That understanding is the final stage we want to achieve. And that is what we achieve when we educate. That comes with and after training, because reflection and making sense are absolutely key. I mean, nothing worse really than possessing information and yet not having a considered sense of how it should be applied and what it means.
And I know we both view, obviously, philosophy as a key tool or mode of inquiry in that development of wisdom. Can you describe to the audience, which is mainly made up of, school superintendents, folks that are at the administrative level here in Canada and abroad, why philosophy is so important, and where can we start thinking about philosophy as a follow-up question in the education system proper?
Well, first, let's understand that the word philosophy, which of course everybody knows when they look in a dictionary, means the love of wisdom. It's not very illuminating. Works rather in a way like the word science. So the word science collects a number of more specialist pursuits like physics, chemistry, biochemistry, the biological sciences, geology, and so forth, astronomy. And philosophy, in the same way as a word, collects a number of intimately related pursuits as it is studied in universities. So the theory of knowledge, what knowledge is, how we acquire it best, the nature of reality, metaphysics, the great questions of ethics, and the idea of the best organization of society, so political theory, and so on. That's philosophy is studied in the universities. But actually, the word has an even more general application in which it means disciplined, thoughtful inquiry about anything, about absolutely anything, which is why philosophical styles of thought, that is the accepting the challenge to look at assumptions, to inspect, examine beliefs and attitudes, to consider carefully what people mean, what they say when they say things. This much more general pursuit requires the application of methods of what we now think of as critical thinking, a phrase, by the way, which is so often used that it's practically lost meaning. But of course it is of the absolute essence, especially in a world now in which we're barraged with all sorts of claims and theories and conspiracy theories and misinformation and partisan polemical opinions. It's so important to be careful in one's thought, to explore, to go deep, not to accept simple answers. But if one is going to really attain some degree of understanding of things, one really has to put that work in. And to do that work, it's good to practice it. That is to think about ideas, to discuss them, to share opinions, to realize that there are very, very few answers to all the great questions that press on us. But nevertheless, investigating what the answers might be or what the various ways of thinking about these things might be is incredibly illuminating. I give you an example, because it's a familiar fact for anybody who has read Plato, that the early dialogues of Plato, the ones that are probably most representative of Socrates' own methods and aims, are what are called aporetic. That's to say they don't reach a conclusion. But on the journey to that failure to reach a definitive answer, a great deal is learned. And this reminds us of a very, very wonderful saying of the French poet Paul Valéry, who said, a difficulty is a light, but an insurmountable difficulty is the sun. So even by tackling something for which it seems impossible to get an answer, you learn a huge amount.
That's wonderful. I want to turn to the formal study of philosophy in just a minute, and particularly the figure of Socrates. But given what you just said, it sounds like you don't need to, or you shouldn't even, start with a formal study of philosophy at a young age. What are the ways that we can incorporate that mode of inquiry into like the primary levels of education?
Well, you certainly don't have to start trying to read Aristotle and Kant at the age of 6. But what you can do is you can get, even very, very young children indeed, to engage with questions in a philosophical manner. In fact, very young children are rather good at this because they haven't started to be closed down by the austere realm of fact and being sensible. So that they are much more playful with ideas, much more prepared in a way to explore them. So, for example, there's an organization in the UK called the Philosophy Foundation, which goes into schools, so these even, early grade schools, And they ask questions like this, that they take in a ring donut, the kind that has a hole in the middle, and they ask the children, what's happened to the hole when you've eaten the donut? And of course, they get tremendously interesting and inventive replies. But this is a fantastic example of how getting people to think, we have this cliche thinking out of the box, but getting people to think that way is enormously helpful. Mm. In the International Baccalaureate, which may perhaps be something that people do in Canada.
It is, yeah.
It's in the UK. They have this theory of knowledge stream, which, really encourages the pupils to think about things in that kind of way. And I have to tell you that when I have a group of students in front of me, first-year students in the first lecture on philosophy, I can tell instantly which of those students have most likely done the International Baccalaureate rather than what we have here in the UK, which is the A-level system. Instant. Because they've got into the practice of joining things up and thinking more broadly. And if that were the one single gain that came from encouraging children all the way through their education to do that, to think philosophically, to look at interesting, even improbable questions and to explore them, it would be intellectually the healthiest thing that could happen to them.
Well, I think that's a good moment to turn to, what I think here in high school, after elementary school would be a great time pretty early on, around 14, 15, 16, to start introducing a formal philosophy course, kind of mandatory, like we have English literature that's mandatory, science courses, of course, that are mandatory to a certain age. And I think, obviously, Socratic thinking has really imbued the education system, I was going to say in the West, but also in the East with Tagore and obviously Dewey here. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of Socrates? You've already mentioned, Plato's early dialogues. Why is Socrates such a key figure in philosophy? And why would you argue that it's important to, like you did, read some of those dialogues fairly young?
Socrates' importance has a number of factors in it. One is, of course, that he lived at a time when, not just in the Athens of the day, but also as it happens in India and in China, a new kind of thinking was coming into focus. Prior to that time, and this generalizes and simplifies, of course, but prior to that time, most societies relied heavily on the conventions and traditions that helped to formulate and stabilize those societies. When people began to challenge that and to question it and to ask whether the beliefs stood up to scrutiny, whether the traditions were really worthwhile or effective, and this was very disruptive. I mean, Socrates eventually was put to death by Athens because he was regarded by his contemporaries, or the more conservative contemporaries in the Athens of the day, as subverting those traditions and as corrupting the youth because he was making them question and challenge those norms. So it was if you like, the sort of secular idea of let's explore these things, let's think for ourselves, let's not make assumptions that the traditional beliefs are right, that was regarded as subversive, but which in its very, very long-term effect, because if you think of our world today, of course, functionally, our world is now one that bases itself on reason and on inquiry, on science and technology. I mean, even in theocratic countries, for example, the functional aspects of life are, in principle, as it were, secular ones. We don't light our houses by prayer, we light them by electricity. And this is the long-term outcome of these new styles of thought, and Socrates was an exemplar of that. The second thing is that he said something which seems very, very simple, even indeed banal, which is that one must think for oneself. But this is actually a very deep and a very subversive thing to say. It's a deep thing to say because it tells us that you cannot really get insight or become wise or understand things unless you do the work of thinking yourself. You know how it is when you read a proverb. You read a proverb and it strikes you as being extremely wise and very good, but it doesn't really get any traction with you. It's experience, it's living, it's really putting ideas to work and seeing when they don't work and which ones do work. That gives you a real insight into them. And so Socrates used to say, well, I don't know anything, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that you don't either yet, until you've really thought these things through and really examined these concepts, so you have a better and a deeper understanding of them. So that idea of persuading people to think for themselves, challenging them to do it, showing them that their first more facile understanding of things was nowhere near rich enough. That method was very important. And indeed, it was precisely what made people think. He was, trying to upend the way traditions and norms worked. So that was the first thing. The second aspect of that think for yourself idea, the subversive aspect of it, is that pretty well all human beings throughout history have been told by those who have some kind of influence over them. So those people in charge, the emperors and the priests and whoever else, that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to the questions that tend to press on us about the right and the good and the way things should be and what the universe is and so forth. A one-size-fits-all answer that, of course, leaves people very dissatisfied and in a way, having to work rather than thinking about them, but work at trying to conform to them. But if you challenge people to take responsibility, to think autonomously, to become responsible for the choices they make and the ideas and beliefs that they subscribe to, then you get, as it were, a revelation of the fact that people are very different, that different things will count as good and flourishing lives for different people, that we all have our individual talents and interests. And even though we may share many things in common about, what conduces to good relationships in society and good societies, nevertheless, trying to make everybody conform to one single way of being, one single kind of life, make them believe that there's just one meaning in life, rather than that there could be as many meanings as there are people to create them. Well, that is a very subversive idea. And so that is something we also owe to Socrates.
So if I can ask you just to linger a little bit more on some of the implications of Socrates' way of thinking. There's really this notion that comes from Socrates of self-criticism. Why is that important, especially given everything that's going on right now?
Well, famously, of course, Socrates was told by an acquaintance, a man called Chaerephon, that he, Chaerephon, had gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked, who is the wisest man in Athens? And the oracle said, it's Socrates. Socrates was puzzled by this until he realized that he was the wisest, because he knew that he knew nothing, whereas everybody else thought they knew lots. But the key to this is that over the entrance to Delphi is the inscription, know thyself. And Socrates realized that one of the keys here is self-understanding. The idea that a really thorough, honest, frank self-understanding had to be part of this endeavor to recognize that one's grasp on important concepts might be too shallow or might be incorrect, that one really hadn't challenged oneself about one's beliefs and outlooks, or thought about digging up the assumptions on which one lived to inspect them and see if they held up under scrutiny. And so this idea of knowing yourself, of challenging your assumptions, of thinking things through, this is a very, very key part of the process that Socrates wanted people to undergo. That is why he didn't, at least in the very early dialogues of Plato, because later on in Plato, he's a mouthpiece for Plato's much more positive and very often rather incredible views. But at any rate, in the early dialogues, we see Socrates never himself offering an opinion or putting forward a thesis, but just again and again and again showing people that what they were saying about what they thought and what they were needed further scrutiny.
So, like in this era that we're in, I tend to say entering into, but we're certainly in the midst of this really rapid technological change. Certainly, the impact that AI has, big data, algorithmic decision making. What reasons are there to emphasize Socratic way of thinking and philosophy in general now more than ever?
Well, in a time like ours, which is full of uncertainties and new challenges, and we find ourselves always behind the curve of what's happening, especially technologically and in great geopolitical shifts that we're seeing. It's important to have a handrail to hang on to. It's important to have some sense of what really matters in general and matters to us personally, so that as we forge our way through these stormy seas, we will retain something of security. It might turn out, of course, given the kinds of changes that pour upon us, that we might have to give up some cherished convictions and beliefs. But to be in a stormy sea without something secure to hang on to is very risky. You get tossed about and less and less about who you are and what's happening. Therefore, to have a clear idea, a clear set of ideas, at any rate, some principles, things that you think are worth hanging on to, worth preserving into a future that may be very different from the past, that requires thought, that requires choice, and the choice has to be a well-considered one. So this idea of reflecting, of thinking, of taking it very seriously, taking very seriously the idea that one has to think these things through, is of the very first importance. And if we can equip people to be able to do that, and if we make it a matter of central importance to individuals throughout their education, but also as something that they carry forward into life and throughout life, that thinking clearly and thinking deeply, and just not accepting the facile, the ready, not clutching at somebody else's ideas as a support, that is something that we really have to commit ourselves to, because it is the handrail that we have as forged those stormy seas.
So do you think, given what AI is really great at, and given the way we've structured our education systems by and large around standardized testing, do you see an opportunity to actually, potentially return to that original sense of the meaning of school?
I very much do, actually, because one doesn't quite know yet exactly what all the implications are of these extremely rapid developments in AI and its applications. Predicting where it will go is risky because of the rapidity with which these changes happen. And if we thought now, there are certain things that AI can't do that only human beings can do, we might very well be proved wrong about that. So that thought that there is some domain which is our very own domain has to be somewhat reapplied from what it is we expect humans to be able to do that AI can't do, to what we individually can do in our own lives and in our relationships, in our responsibilities in society, that remains under our own control, our own choice. That's very important. That requires thought. That requires clarity. That requires an equipment of ideas that one has explored, put together, and framed that help us one do that. And that's really in a way rather speaking about the very great importance that attaches to having made a practice of thinking in those ways. And part of that practice, of course, is a practice not just simply at analysis of ideas, but also the practice of listening, of hearing and understanding other ideas. Many of the world's problems, if not indeed all of them, but certainly all domestic problems anyway, arise from not hearing what other people say or not really understanding what it is they're trying to say. And so being an attentive listener and being patient in hearing what other people have to say as a starting point for your analysis of it is important too. That's something that comes out of discussion, debate. That's very much, of course, part of the Socratic procedure.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems, given how we've structured the system to, I believe you use the term that I like very much, create economic foot soldiers. And that leads right into the standardized testing and how to, sort of sort those that'll, be really useful to the economy as opposed to those that are really great thinkers or questioners. And that is harder to assess, right? This kind of Socratic method, those are really great at thinking that way. Do you have any inclinations as to, maybe even given AI and how you could use AI to find a new way of assessing, a new way of, creating this entire system from, elementary school to high school to university?
Well, there is a big opportunity there. I mean, if AI can really catch the individuality of a person's talents and capacities, and provide us with data that may very well be lost by the normal traditional standardized tests. After all, the standardized tests are a net through which we lose many, many potentially very talented and gifted individuals. And the more talented, the more gifted, the more likely they are to be outliers, and therefore they don't show up very well on standardized tests. Some years ago, when I founded a college, we may mention later on a bit about that. One thing I wanted to do was I wanted us to interview every candidate personally and not to rely only or even very much indeed on the outcome of standardized tests. Because I thought that what we wanted was people whose abilities and whose potential was something that might come out if we could explore it a little bit on their terms and actually meet them on their ground and talk to them about it. And I've found actually in the past that, some very, very gifted people don't register very well on the standard examination system, precisely because it doesn't have the sensitivity really to catch those things about them. If I had my way, I would give up examinations altogether, and I would do everything on the basis of really exploring individual capacity and potential. Of course, that's impractical in time and money terms, which is exactly why standardized tests exist. And that's very unfortunate. But as you imply, AI might be able to help us to do that. You see, if we had systems that were able to explore and analyze things that are very interesting, very unusual, very individual to the person in question, then we might have a much better sense of what we can capture. And by the way, I should add also that when we think about what we want of people when they've gone through an education system, we now, I'm afraid, far too much put emphasis on their potential to be participants in the great economic battle. So we're thinking about their careers, about what kind of work they can do. And we fail to remember enough that they're not just employees or entrepreneurs. They're also voters and lovers, travelers and parents and potentially and so on. There are many, many aspects to life, for none of which is there any specific kind of, or for very few of which at any rate, there's specific kind of training, but rather this general ability to listen, to see, to hear, to think, and also to be very conscious of the fact that there may be no definite answers. That's an important thing too. That if we were thinking that education, the education part of the system rather than the training part of the system, had somehow to help them and equip them to do that, then we would be doing something that perhaps, apropos of your suggestion there, AI might be able to help us see too. Well, this person would really benefit from being able to read philosophy and literature, because that's going to enrich their lives wonderfully. I mean, I don't know whether an AI system could do that, but we know that that's the hope that we have for them.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity there to take what was previously impractical. Like, I loved your example, and that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, because not only are you a writer, philosopher, and thinker, but you're also a very dedicated educator, and as you mentioned, set up a college. And I love the example of interviewing all of the students that you're admitting. Now, that's not practical in previous times, but oral presentations that are kind of assessed, at least at face value or at an initial stage, by an AI that can help administrators understand, okay, this person's very eloquent, right? This person can, speak to, how should I say this? In common dialogue or in common thinking, is very, the exact kind of student that we would want at our college. So I think there are some practical implications that it could help with.
Yes. So if, the AI system could have what a skilled interviewer could have, which is the ability to pick up on something in something that a candidate says, a follow-up question, an ability to spot something and to pursue that line of thought. And indeed, AI might very well already be able to do that, or might soon be able to do that, then that really would be ideal. I spent the first part of my career teaching at Oxford, and I took part there, of course, in interviews of candidates. It was very interesting to see how often, in those cases, the kinds of candidates who were invited to interview to Oxford, and they had, of course, ticked pretty well all the boxes before they got there. But then the question was sorting out those among them who had that something extra, that something which really interested one and made one think, golly, this is somebody it would be great to teach. This is somebody who's really going to benefit from this, and so on, that kind of thing. And in those interview situations, the dynamic of them was that a kind of dialectic had to unfold from the inner logic of the situation. So you ask a question and you get a really interesting and surprising answer. And that means that the interviewer has himself or herself, to be pretty, or smart enough at any rate to pick up on that and follow it through. So it can be very nuanced. It can be a very subtle thing. And also in the end, of course, the outcome is an impression. It's not something that you could, if you gave a score to it, let's say on your sheet, said, well, this person is a 9 out of 10, and therefore we ought to admit them. You're tremendously simplifying when you do that, even though you have to do it. But it is an impression in the end that you get about ability, about a person's mind. And by the way, I've found also that a really good mark of intelligence, this is something which I rely on in interviewing students and also people who are going to join my faculty, is whether they have a sense of humor, whether they can pick up on, little dry jokes and what have you, because that is a great mark of intelligence. And indeed, the very word wit, until quite recently, actually meant intelligence. It didn't meant, a sort of funny bone. So, and that is something which an AI would have to be able to do too, to pick up on a little bit of wryness, a little bit of humorous glint in the eye thing, because those are very, very, very telling marks of mental capacity.
That's interesting. I mean, there's something there too of how impactful comics in particular these days are with, dare I say, speaking truth to power. And they're not typically educated in the way that we would say here with a humanistic background, but I think there's something there for sure. If I can ask you to reflect on why you started the college, what was the driving force behind that, and maybe describe for the audience, what it is?
So it was a combination of factors. As I mentioned, I started my teaching career at Oxford. And when I did begin teaching there, the tutorial model was very much still in its traditional form. Now, the tutorial was spending ideally with one pupil an hour, encouraging the pupil to think, to articulate, formulate a view and to articulate it. And by questioning and challenging, get that pupil to really work out the idea a little bit and to grasp it better. The temptation always, when you had a pupil who was struggling to formulate or to understand, the temptation to make suggestions or to offer them something, or even indeed to end up giving them a lecture one-to-one, in your study, really had to be resisted, because the process was encouraging that thinking on the part of the pupil, himself or herself. And I remember once very early on, I had a salutary experience, which is that I had a pupil to whom I'd asked a question, and she sat for a long time in silence. And eventually, of course, out of a certain anxiety for her, or worried that she was struggling or something, I began to offer a suggestion. And she said to me, "Shut up, I'm thinking," which I found in equal parts rather abashing, but also very admirable. It taught me a very good lesson there. Well, as time has gone on, of course, the pressure of numbers and of time, the tutorial has become 1 to 2, so 2 students or 3 students, or even a small group of people. And look, if you think about it, think about interviewing a person for a job, or think about interviewing 2 people for the same job at the same time. It's a very different dynamic. Mm-hmm. And this ability to work through conversation, discussion, through the dialectic of that process, where you're helping to guide and indeed very often learning from the pupil as well, which is exciting. I mean, then you find that you're in a cooperative enterprise. That's absolutely wonderful. So that was a very precious thing that was even begun to get on the way out at the time that I started. Then I went to London University, at Birkbeck College at London University, where I became a professor later on. And we used the tutorial method there too, but it was only with graduate students with whom we were able to have one-to-one supervisions and go through that process. And that, of course, is a slightly different process, because there, the graduate student, very often, if it's a PhD student, will have a thesis that they're wishing to argue. And so they're bringing something slightly different to the conversation, or more developed anyway. So then I thought to myself, well, there is a great stampede going on in higher and further education towards vocational subjects, business studies and IT, to the STEM subjects, all of which, by the way, are very important in our world. There's no question. I mean, our world, runs on questions of the economy, more and more technological aspects. And of course, people must be equipped to participate in that. But at the same time, there was a diminishment, a correlative diminishment in interest in the humanities. And it seems to me that history, philosophy, literature, and there are very deep connections between them, as I suggested earlier on. These civilizational things, these things which provide context, these things which situate us and what we do within this broader horizon. I thought we need to, really stand up for them too, and make sure that they don't get quite displaced or marginalized. And I was inspired, in fact, by something that a very distinguished physicist said, and this was the Nobel Prize winning physicist Steven Weinberg, years ago, when Ronald Reagan had been talking about putting anti-ballistic missile defense systems up in space, the so-called Star Wars initiative. Steven Weinberg said, "Doesn't bother me that the president doesn't understand science, but it does bother me that he doesn't know any history or philosophy, because if he did, he would dream of doing this, of escalating the Cold War." And that seemed to me, therefore, that it was absolutely vital that one should, stand up for, encourage, add to whatever provision there was in the humanities. So I founded a college called the New College of the Humanities, which focused on the central humanities, which had as its pedagogical model the tutorial system, which admitted people by interview, which, in other words, brought together all these things that I most deeply believed in about education education as opposed to training at what it's for. And I had a sneaky trick for making it acceptable, which is that acknowledging the importance of understanding business and technology, I required of all my students, no matter what subject they were studying, that they do alongside what we called the professional program. So this was something, really it was a kind of business studies light. So you could read a spreadsheet and understand something about marketing, and just something that would give them a little bit of help when they went out into the world of work, but also that they should be literate. I mean, literate, not expert, not white collar in the lab, but literate about the major aspects of today's sciences. Have an overview of what's happening in physics and astronomy and astrophysics and the biological sciences. But also all of them, even if they weren't actually doing philosophy, perhaps if they were doing history or politics or literature, that everybody should think about applied ethics, about big ethical questions it faces. And so this was a compulsory strand to their other studies. So that, but when they said to their parents, for example, well, I want to study philosophy at university, and the parents said, well, what's good is that going to do you? They would say, well, there's this course where I could also do a bit of IT and business studies, and that would kind of inoculate them against it. Although, of course, the better answer, study philosophy at university, makes you the kind of person that across an entire range of careers, journalism, law, politics, the creative industries, publishing, teaching, education. I mean, across a whole range of things is the ideal basis for having a successful career in them.
That's great. I mean, I worked at as a student in university. I got a job on General Motors assembly line. Okay. And most of the other students were studying engineering or something very related to manufacturing. And the workers there, they knew we were students, would ask everybody what you're studying. And I told them English literature and philosophy. One of them looked at me, he's like, you might as well just stay right on this line for the rest of your life. And it kind of stuck with me over the years. And I always compared, what I was doing to, how financially stable anyway I would have been if I stayed on the line, which I just wouldn't have been able to survive for how mind-numbing a job it was. I questioned myself until I was about, or I always had that point of comparison until I was about 36, when the line I worked on was shut down and downsized. So that really stuck with me and has really been, besides all the aspects that it's helped me with in my personal life and a professional life, it's helped me to think through a variety of problems. So I think it's very astute the way you structured all of that. But I actually have this book here that I just happened to be rereading again. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Not for Profit: Why Democracy Needs the Humanities by Martha Nussbaum. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the humanities for a robust and healthy democracy?
Well, very much so. I mean, as I said earlier on, we educate far too much now just for careers, just for the job you can get when you leave education, and not for life as a whole. And life as a whole involves one's responsibilities to and one's involvement in society and in matters of the state. And in a democracy, the ideal is to have people who are well-informed and thoughtful, a little bit longer term in their thinking, tiny bit less self-interested in their thinking about the good of the polity overall and about what one can contribute to it. And from that point of view, to have this what I always describe as this broader horizon of view, and having, put some things together, realize that there are people who don't share one's opinions or outlooks, thinking of ways that one can nevertheless get on with them, find areas of compromise and cooperation. All these things are really important. And so to come out of a background in which one has surveyed, one has traveled over terrains of thought and choice and experience that gives one a much more empathetic view of others, a much better sense indeed of how the perfect, the best can be the enemy of the good, that kind of consideration. all those things help to make one a much better citizen, a much better participant, a more thoughtful and valuable member of the society. Democracy needs that. Even if you try to perfect the institutions of democracy, they're never going to protect us against eventualities, against things that happen, and against the fact that in no society is there a majority for anything. All societies are collections of minorities, including minorities of one, and therefore a society works best if one can forego the desire to try and achieve some sort of uniformity or identity, and instead one seeks to achieve harmony. Harmony is a much better aim than uniformity or identity. Recognizing the diversity that there is among individuals, and the fact that any society is a texture made up of many different threads, is very, very important, especially understanding that things can really deeply matter to people whose experience, whose outlook, whose interests are not yours. And so an educated person, that is a person whose mind is furnished, broadened by this wider understanding, is absolutely vital. Martha Nussbaum's book is excellent on this. It's a very important book, and the lesson that it seeks to teach is one that we very much need to learn, especially now.
How pessimistic or optimistic are you that we can sort of tame this sort of violent current that is in politics now and in the global stage?
Well, the first thing to realize is that most of us, I think probably me a bit more than you, because you're a bit younger than I am, Jason, lucky you, have lived through a rather unusual time in history in the West. So we've lived in the West through a period of relative peace and prosperity and stability. And this, in fact, and tragically, is not the norm in history at all. Things tend to be much rockier, more fragile, more turbulent than we've experienced in our rather privileged place and time. And we seem to be back rather in more normal times, so to speak, from the historical perspective now. So the thing is that teaches us, if we understand it, that teaches us that the things that we really value, the things that are important, including things like individual liberty, human rights and the civil liberties, and also, very importantly, the rule of law, not ruled by capricious men, but ruled by things that we agree we want to live under and that will organize our relationships to one another. Those things are very valuable possessions. And hanging on to them, fighting for them, means being engaged. You can't just turn away. You can't close your eyes to the fact that if you're going to have the things individually and in society that you value, you've got to work for them. But also, there's no alternative to optimism other than getting onto the top of a high building and jumping off. I mean, that's what you would do if you were, fully pessimistic about everything. You have to be optimistic. You have to hope that, given that there are so many good things about people and good things about our societies already that are worth preserving, that one should work for them. I point out to my students, I say to them, I ask them the question, I say, why are the newspapers and the broadcast media full of stories of conflict and war and suffering and murder and what have you? It's horrendous. But of course, we know there's a psychological reason for this, that we are more attuned to things that are threatening and troubling because there's a survival value to doing so. But the reason that the news media are full of these things is because they are relatively rare. I say you don't see a headline on the front page of the daily newspaper which says shopkeeper is polite to customer. Why? Because these things happen too often. They happen every second of every day, everywhere around the world, and millions of transactions and contacts between people are, generally speaking, okay or even positive. But they're relatively rare things. They're not rare enough by a long chalk, but the relatively rare things that make news, because they're troubling. So one can take hope out of that fact. But one also takes hope out of the fact that, it's now a common experience that if you're on social media and you get savagely trolled by people who say terrible, ugly, violently unpleasant things about you or against you, and you ever get an opportunity to confront such a person, the likelihood is that they'll apologize and say sorry and what have you, just because that medium, so easily exploits the moment and the anonymity that masks your, ability to say these things. So all these things show that there is a lot of material for hope, and one should try to live on that hope.
If
Very sorry, Jason.
No problem.
A bit of editing required here.
Take your time. No problem.
Gonna have a sip.
Yes, and I'll do the same. Well, thank you, Anthony. I've got 2 more questions for you if you have the time.
I hope my answer's not going on too long.
No, they're wonderful. I'd rather you talk more than me. You're much, much, much more eloquent than I ever could be. So it's been wonderful. Thank you. So, Anthony, my penultimate question, and we'll turn now again to the education system, is always, if you had a magic wand and can do anything to the public education system, what would that be?
Well, the very, very first thing to do would be to increase hugely the number of teachers in the system and to pay them extremely well. It used to be the case back in the past when relatively few people went to school that there were enough and sometimes more than enough teachers to go around. And also, teachers were valued members of the community. You go back to the 19th century in England, for example, in a local community, the vicar, the doctor, and the teacher would be the principal figures in the society, the most respected. And teaching was an honored and respected vocation. And for that reason, the fact that it perhaps not even then might have been the most highly paid profession was not that significant because, of course, the status of the teacher in society was very high. And status is something that in itself is a reward. But nowadays, when, it's the price of everything and the value of nothing, when a person's income is the marker of how, their celebrity or their status in society, relatively low paid professions, therefore, are disdained. And this is in many different ways a very bad effect. But there are, I think, rather few people who go into teaching, hoping to become rich. They go into it because they have something of a vocation or an interest in it. They have a talent for it, maybe. They're interested in children and like them. So these are people who are among the most important people on the planet, because after all, the effect that they have on the whole lives of the people that they teach is very significant. Every one of us remembers a good teacher, a kind teacher, a teacher who inspired us. Every one of us does. And this shows you that teachers should be really among the most valued and important people, and they should be properly rewarded. So my magic wand would produce as many teachers as possible, reward them as well as possible, value them properly, and therefore reduce the staff-student ratio in schools so that there can be more attention to individuality in schools, more time, more capacity, more headspace to recognize, what those students need. If you go back to the point about individuality, about all of us being individuals, each one of us has a certain grain to our personality or a certain grain to our minds. And if one can find a way of working with that grain, this is why the one-to-one tutorial is so ideal. If you can find that way, you can really unleash all sorts of potential. You can really get the pupil to inspire himself or herself with a desire to learn and to know and to understand it, to go further, to explore more. The old-fashioned way of teaching in which, again, because of pressure of numbers and so on, it was a case of, as it were, downloading content from the teacher's neck-top computer to the pupil's neck-top computer all sitting in well-disciplined rows and taking notes. I mean, that lost so many people. They just left so many people behind who could have been big contributors and who could have had lives that were much, much more flourishing. The idea now that we let children explore and teach themselves and learn and teach one another, that has a great deal to recommend it. Although, again, mixed mode, make sure that children, that students at any level in education have the basic equipment. They can add and subtract, they can spell, they can multiply, they can read, they can have all the basic equipment. That takes good training, and finding good ways of potentiating those abilities is very important. But then to liberate the potential in a student, once thus equipped, requires being a bit focused on each individual student and providing opportunities and the space for that. And one way of doing it, it's not the only way, but one way of doing it is to make sure there are enough good, well-rewarded teachers around to do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that is probably the central issue that we need to resolve. And I remember reading somewhere that I think Plato said a class size beyond 6 is not manageable. I don't know. Did you ever come across that? I mean, I always use that as the number to kind of shock people into what typical classroom size could look like. We can probably stretch that to maybe 15 or something like that. But
no, I'm with Plato. If he didn't say it, by the way, you should have said it.
You should have said it.
I'm with him on that. Yeah, you've picked up already that I thought the ideal is 1-to-1. That is the ideal, but maybe at the university level, because of course, I mean, the point is sometimes well made that when you have a very small group of students, so perhaps half a dozen of them indeed, then they hear one another too, not just the teacher, not just themselves. So then there's sharing of idea, and there can be cooperative learning going on. So yes, I mean, I do think that that one-to-one tutorial shouldn't be the only thing available. They really ought to have the seminar or the lecture or the other opportunities too.
Professor Grayling, my final question is always, what book, movie, video, article, podcast would you recommend to the audience?
Oh dear, it's that kind of question is what I call a beauty contest question, because you have to pick one winner, don't you?
You don't have to pick one. No, you can pick 10 if you want. That's fine.
Oh, well, then if we've got breakfast organized for tomorrow morning, I can get to work on this. But I don't know. I mean, look, I would recommend genres rather than individual books, because people will know the outstanding books in these genres. But I think, literature from classical times to the present, what stands out as those books which have been most admired and most enjoyed, including those that are well thought of in our present day as well. They are all of them going to be, as I described literature earlier, windows into life, windows into the human mind and human experience. And being a good reader, an attentive reader who relishes stories, there's going to be a huge amount that one gets from it. But one, by the way, shouldn't disdain. I said all the way from classical literature up until now, because it's very, very remarkable that a lot of classical literature, so I'm talking Homer, I'm talking Thucydides, I'm talking Virgil and Ovid, is very accessible and very enjoyable, and too often neglected, I think. I mean, let us remind ourselves that the British Empire, well, that thing of the past, was run by young men who had done nothing but read Greek and Latin at school, and they were sent out to run the empire. And you might think to yourself, well, how did that work? What did they get from Greek and Latin? Well, if you read Greek and Latin literature, you learn politics, you learn philosophy, you learn ethics, you learn history, you learn generalship, you learn about wars, you learn about what happened to states, you learn about legal proceedings, court cases, you get insights into, all the most important factors of human life, love and death. I mean, you equip somebody who's one bit thoughtful with such a budget of stuff that when they go out there and they confront actual experiences and people with needs and what have you in the jungles of Burma or wherever it might be, it can be of some use to you. So that is an example of why literature, and I would include in it the reading of history. I think it is so important that one has that a good rich context of historical understanding, and that one has accepted the philosophical challenge to think, examine assumptions. What do people mean when they use this word or that word? Well, what does that concept actually do? Plumbing into that a little bit, treating philosophy as disciplined, thoughtful inquiry, and that as something that applies to everything that one thinks and deals with. So, reading in all these things is without question a necessity of life.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Professor Grayling, thank you very much for your time.
Jason, thank you for having me on.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.